Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the second topic in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, which is aggregate supply. So one thing is that I've actually renumbered this unit before or after I printed it. And so in fact, all of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply is all in lecture 7.1. 7.2 is going to be when you put them together and see equilibrium. And then 7.3 will be fiscal policy. So aggregate supply. So this is basically the same story that we told about aggregate demand, but instead it's with aggregate supply. And in this one, it's all the goods and services that producers are willing to sell at all the different price levels. And another way to think about it is it's the supply for everything by everybody in the United States that's producing, right? So add it all together. That's what aggregate kind of means here. And there's two aggregate supply curves. That's kind of the bad news that I'll break to you right off the bat. There's one that exists in the short run, and there's one that exists in the long run. And this might be a good point to remember that the short run is not a time-based phenomena, right? It's about, do you have, in the sense of it's not a month, right? It's the idea of, in the short run, this is saying that this is too short a time for wages and input costs and things like that to react if the price level changes. So that's actually how we define the short run here. Is do you have time to change the wages and the inputs and those kinds of things in response to price level changes? And if you don't, right, in the short run, when you don't, it's too short amount of time, then that's what we call sticky wages. So an example of that would be that, Mr. Glossinger, old Daniel here, I'm on a union wage contract, right? I have a wage contract that means that I get paid the same for a 12-month period of time. And so they're stuck, right? Even if inflation goes up, they're stuck at what they were. And so we'd say that my wages are sticky in that sense. And if I were a factory worker, right? If I were a factory worker, we would actually see that as the price level for the product that I produce, if it were to go up, then my employer would say, all right, let's try to ramp up more production, and we would produce more output. And that would be, this is the kind of explanation for why this happens, that would be because they don't have to pay me more in response to the higher prices initially. So imagine if I'm a laborer working in a factory, I'm on a wage contract. Well, if basically the employer can sell the product for a little bit more because prices are higher, right? Price levels in the economy are higher, but they can keep my wage at this kind of lower previous amount, then they're going to ramp up production and capture basically profit on the difference, because they'll be able to sell the product for a higher price, but they don't have to pay me a higher wage. And so in the short run, they'll quickly ramp up production as fast as they can, because every single unit that they can sell before they have to pay me more, of course, they get a lot more profit on. Now, in the long run, right, in the long run, wages and input prices would adjust. So my employer eventually, after a week, a 2 week, a couple of months, however long it takes, eventually I'm going to go as the factory worker to my employer and say, you need to pay me more in response to these higher prices. And so what the employer then has to do is they say, oh, snap, doggone it. As you know, I have to pay my workers more. So it's going back to kind of this equilibrium, to this long run level where they used to be producing, right? So it kind of returns back to where it used to be. And we've got a graph of both of these. So they both will be graphed at the same time. So whenever we graph aggregate supply, we're actually going to put both lines on here. And so just as before, the x-axis, you can write GDPR, or you could write Y, right? Y standing for output. And up here, we're going to put PL for price levels. And this short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. SRAS is upward sloping. And again, that's because as the price level, right, if you can imagine the price level rising, right, as prices rise, they would generate more output in response. And the reason they do that, again, is written right up here, right? Because they can increase their profit, right? That's kind of the short explanation of what I just said here. And if it helps you to write it out, right? Write it out. It's written right down below. As price levels go up, firms will increase the amount of output that they produce, because they'll capture profit by not paying that higher wage and the higher input price to produce, but they get to keep the higher price of the product that they sell, right? And so this happens all over the American economy. And then eventually, though, right, the workers and the input sellers and those things, they'll catch up, and then it kind of goes back to this long run. So the long run amount, what we would kind of say here, is kind of generally fixed, at least in our understanding. This long run amount is just a certain amount of output, and the prices of it don't really have a big effect on it. In the long run, there's this kind of amount of capacity that we have in the economy, and if we're producing at capacity, right, then that's just where we are. We're at that kind of equilibrium. And as we go further with this model, we're going to find that it connects to the PPC in some important ways. But the short explanation right now can just be actually that this amount of output, right, this amount Y here, corresponds to YF, or full employment, which is, you're at that kind of normal level of employment of your resources in that sense. So we're going to come back to this, of course, as time goes on. Now, there are things that can move the aggregate supply curve, and I'm going to skip this extension here, but it is kind of interesting about the shape of the SRAS, and it has some important outcomes as well. And I talked about this. This LRAS kind of represents the potential output. It's the trend line in the business cycle graph, and it's also that frontier line in the PPC. It corresponds to full employment. So if it helps, actually, we can draw a little PPC off to the right, and we'll say these are capital goods and these are consumer goods, and this would be corresponding, right, to a point of output that is full employment, right? So we could say YF. Full employment, or this one could also be YF or whatever. Remember, this would be a point of unemployment, right? Too little resources being employed. And we're going to see the connections between these two graphs quite a bit. Now, as I said, we've got shifters. And for the shifters of these, there isn't CIGXN. CIGXN affects aggregate demand. The shifters, though, of aggregate supply are IRAP. Now, a long time ago, I learned from Jacob Clifford this trick when I was at a conference with him, and it was the idea of, those old rappers, and they're rapping, they're like, and they're doing this, and they're going, IRAP, right? And those are inflationary expectations, resource prices, right? They're rapping, inflationary expectations, resource prices, actions of the government affecting producers and productivity. And so they're rapping, right? This is the IRAP, right? Inflationary expectations, resource prices, actions of the government that affect producers and productivity. Now, I've given you some examples of what these things could shift. The first one is inflationary expectations. Note that it's not actually just a change in price level, but the expectation of it. Right? Those are two different things. It's not actually the change itself in this case. Remember, because if price level changed, that just moves you along the curve. This is actually saying the expectation about what it'll be in the future. And this can affect the aggregate supply curve. But actually just changing, right? A change in price levels doesn't shift the curve, right? So that's important. It doesn't shift either of the curves. Change in price level doesn't shift the curves, but your expectations about it can. So if households expect increased price levels, we'd say therefore, right? Therefore, they demand, maybe that's not a good word, that's an econ word, increased wages. Okay, now when they do that, that actually pushes them into this category, resource prices. So resource prices are actually one of the fundamental shifters of aggregate supply, because when we talk about like the supply curve, remember, it's the cost of producing. It's your minimum willingness that you're willing to provide something for sale. So if we had aggregate supply, it's all of your minimum willingnesses. That's kind of a little abstract, but the basic idea here is that anything that makes it more expensive to produce the good, right, then it's going to decrease the amount that you're supplying to the market. That's the idea here. So another name for this is input costs, because really it's just costs. If it's more costly, if it's we'd say more costly to produce, we'd say therefore that decreases short run aggregate supply. Okay. And there are lots of things that could affect being, inputs, right? Anything that goes into producing the thing would be an input. So really common ones, I'm going to give you two that are by far the most common, would be oil prices and wages of your workers, right? Those are the two most common of the workers. So right? Oil prices. Why would that be an input? Well, into virtually everything, oil as a price is an input. In this pen, it's made of plastic. It's literally made out of oil. But how did this pen get into my hand? Well, it was trucked there, usually on a semi truck, and that required oil. So it's more expensive to buy the oil. The pen is more expensive, and the supplier of the pen can't supply as much. It'll decrease the supply. Likewise, the wages of the workers are not, this is an important aspect, they are not a consumption shifter. Remember, the people who make the object are not necessarily the same people who are buying the object. And so we'd say that if the wages of the pen makers go up, that's not going to affect the aggregate supply, or that's not going to affect, the consumption in the whole economy. Right, that's kind of a separate animal. The wages of the workers changing will affect the supply of the thing itself. Right, it's an input cost. Remember, NITI was our acronym for supply, and the I in it was input costs, and that's all that this one is. Wages of workers, oil prices, anything that affects your wages of workers here. So union membership rates and all those sorts of things. Utility prices. It couldn't just be oil. It might be electricity. It might be anything else that goes into the production. Okay, I've talked at length. The third shifter would be actions of the government that affect producers. And this one is probably best to say regulations, right? Regulations are a big part here, but also, so that's kind of your example. Also, we'd say taxes on production, right? Specifically taxes on production. So sometimes you're going to see questions where they use that as a way of saying, this is an action that affects producers. So it's not just taxes in general. Most of the time when you see a question that says taxes went up, it's going to be taxes went up on the consumers, on the households. If it goes up on the households, that affects their consumption. If it goes up on the producers, it's going to affect the supply. Because it's literally an extra cost, right? If taxes go down, it's going to be, it's going to reduce the cost. So we kind of think about taxes on production as something in the supply side, and usually they'll make it nice and clear. Regulations, though, are an easy example of this. If you have heavy environmental regulations, right, and say what you will about those, but those add a cost to production. And so if you're adding something, if you're making it more costly to produce, well, what do we write right here? If it's more costly to produce, short and aggregate supply decreases. And so again, this is really just a fancy way of saying, does it affect the cost of production, right? Because that's all this one is really about. And the last one here is productivity. And this is the idea that if basically you can produce more with the same costs as before, you're more productive, right? And that's kind of the reverse of this statement. It's more costly to produce, that decreases the aggregate supply. If it's less costly to produce, it increases the aggregate supply. So if it's less costly to make the same amount, right? And what we'd say is that's productivity has gone up. When we say it's less costly to make the same amount of stuff, we're saying productivity has gone up. We'd say, therefore, there's an increase in short run aggregate supply. And there are a couple of things that do that. Typically, we'd say technology is a big aspect of it. So anything where you can combine your resources in a new way and produce more stuff with the same amount, right, of inputs, or essentially, you can produce the same amount of output, but with less inputs. Those are two of the same thing, right? If you're producing the same amount of stuff, but it doesn't require as many inputs, or you take the same amount of inputs, but you can make more outputs, both of those are the same as productivity. That's what we call technology, right? You're combining your resources in a new way. Now, for all of these, right, that we kind of have to ask ourselves, does it affect the long run or the short run? Now, 99% of the time, it's just going to be the short run. 99% of the time. And in fact, I've never seen a question that asks you to shift the long run on a graph. Just so you remember, if we had SRAS moving to the right, oops, that's a 2. That's terrible. That's an increase. If you have SRAS moving to the left, right? That's a decrease. But we usually aren't going to move the LRAS around, at least on the graph. Now, if there's a permanent change in one of these things, that could affect the long run. And in fact, the wrap part, right, could be long run. And you're going to know if the question's guiding you to that, whether you should say, well, in the long run, the LRAS would move, right? But 99% of the time, you're not going to really graph that. It might just be the very end of a question, and it'll say, okay, now that, assume that this shift is permanent, right? What's going to happen in the long run to the aggregate supply curve? Well, the answer is if it's a permanent shift, well, then the long run curve will move, right? But you can imagine where, this might not, this resource price thing and oil prices might go up, but they might come down next Tuesday. And so that's not really permanent. But if there's a permanent change, let's say regulations, or maybe there's a permanent advance in technology, then that can shift the long run curve to the right. And the last thing I'm going to teach you, and then we're going to go, is this. If this LRAS curve moves to the right, what do you think happens to this picture over here on the right? Right? So if LRAS increases, then what happens in this picture? And remember, as you think about how to answer that question, that LRAS just represents like the full amount of capacity in the economy. So what would happen over here? I'm going to leave you to think about that one. See you next time.